Disclaimer: I will be discussing a rail-related disaster that some of those watching may feel distressed by. Viewers' discretion is advised. In the time of history, there came the railroads, steel lines snaking their way across landscapes around the world. Man tamed the mountains and the valleys, with engineering prowess on full display. The locomotive, first powered by steam, were designed to traverse these railroads, technology that is the lifeblood of many towns and cities across the world today. Tragically, with every form of technology, human error is abundant, from reckless endangerment to poor design to intentional sabotage. Man has a lot to pay for, with innocent human souls being the currency. But man is not the only dealer of this precious currency, for nature also cashes in. From landslides to earthquakes, it continues to fight back against humanity. One such transaction would result in the worst rail disaster in New Zealand and the 8th worst in the world at the time. This is the story of the Tangiwai Disaster of 1953. For centuries, the local Maori tribes ruled over all of New Zealand, with English settlers arriving in the late 1700s. Many settlements spawned from this, with towns established with English names, but with a majority in the North Island still being Maori. Mount Ruapehu, which roughly translates as Pit of Noise, is one of the largest mountains in size in the North Island, being a large mass growing from the earth. In this area of the country, the winters can be cold and the summers warm. Atop the mountain is the glacial lake. This lake is naturally forming glacial blue amongst the white snowcap. But this lake is not a permanent fixture, for it occasionally breaks its banks and spills down the mountain, causing flooding of the nearby Whangaehu River. As the NZR progressed through the King Country, they were not aware of this fact, building through the landscape without much of a care. The railway would pass through the town of Waiouru, the present home of an NZ Army training zone, and through a small settlement of Tangiwai. Tangiwai, which translates roughly from Maori as weeping water, was so named because of the floods of the river, which at the Whangaehu River that the railway passed through was crossed by a simple girder bridge. 1953 was a momentous time for New Zealand, for Edmund Hillary, later Sir Edmund Hillary, was the first recorded man to climb Mount Everest with Tenzing Norgay, and the Queen would ascend to the throne. As part of her coronation tour, she would travel across the Commonwealth, spending December 1953 in the small country of New Zealand, which was a very major deal indeed. Because NZ is in the southern hemisphere and in December, summer is in full swing, so the sun sets later and the temperatures are a lot warmer, which may have contributed to the disaster. By 1953, the KA-class locomotive was reigning supreme on NZR metals, prominently seen on passenger trains. One of these was the Wellington to Auckland Express. The 145-ton locomotive was able to handle this train with ease, with streamlining on some members being a prime example of NZ engineering, featuring prominently on the advertising. But on the night of December 24, 1953, the KA class would become famous for the wrong reasons. The train departed that Christmas Eve from Wellington at 3 PM, a sleeper-type train that would take anywhere between 12 and 20 hours to reach Auckland. On this train consisted 5 second-class carriages, 4 first-class carriages, a guards van, finally trailed by the postal van, giving the total weight of the train that night 467.3 tons. The KA, being a 1400 horsepower machine, was able to handle this service with ease. KA 949 would haul this service, recently overhauled just 4 months prior. Confusingly, the carriages were labelled E to A for the second class carriages from the engine, with Z, X, V and W being the following first class carriages. I will henceforth describe the carriages as based upon these designations, but everything will become easier to understand as I progress. It is unknown who the original crew of the train were at the time, but it is known that a crew change would happen at Taihape, where Charles Parker, the driver, and Lance Redmond, the fireman, would take over the service. Both veterans of the NZR, they knew the route through the King Country incredibly well. At roughly 7:20 that night, engine driver D. Bentley took a goods train over the Tangiwai Bridge, noting that nothing was amiss. At the station of Tangiwai, the station agent Raymond Hall would wait as the night grew longer, not knowing what was about to happen. At Waiouru, the train would be ever so slightly delayed as passengers disembarked, but finally the go-ahead was given, and the express set out into infamy with 285 passengers aboard. In what would be an incredibly cruel twist of fate, there was a goods train that was expected to have traversed the Whangaehu River section, but this was delayed, so the express was given priority. Had the goods train been on time, it's likely the disaster would have been relegated to history as a minor accident, just a simple derailment, maybe the crew injured or dead, but that would be a minor death toll compared to what would end up happening. Back at the station of Tangiwai, Raymond Hall would stand on the station platform, which was nothing more than a small hamlet, watching the express pass by at an estimated 40 miles per hour, slightly slower than usual, but acceptable at the time. As he sat back down, he heard a loud roaring noise, but could not see what happened, only seeing the red taillights of the express when he looked outside his window. Daniel Chapman had been driving on the desert road at this time. His car had overheated, and on the search for water, he would notice that the river was a swirling grey torrent of water, a rushing wave that almost took him with it. He was likely the only person with some prior warning to the disaster that was to follow. What he had witnessed that night was a lahar, defined simply as a destructive mud flow from a mountain, which it most certainly was on that night. Aboard the express, Beverly and John Mahi were expected to have had first-class tickets, but due to a lack of seating, they were consequently in a second-class carriage. As John has described, the guard, William Inglis, would finally find 2 seats at the rear of the train in a first-class carriage, unknowingly changing the fates of Beverly and John. By the time of the disaster as the train left Waihuru, most passengers are currently asleep. We reach a part of the story that is a bit muddy, so we'll attempt to clarify what would happen. Cyril Ellis had been driving towards Ohakune with his mother-in-law and wife when he suddenly stopped the car, because the road bridge over the Whangaehu River was completely swamped. As he backed the car, he saw a light in the distance. Realizing with horror that it was a train, he grabbed a flashlight from the dash and ran towards the rails in an attempt to stop it. Whether he reached the rails is up for debate, for the distance between the road and rail is approximately 200 meters, as well as 2 fences and an embankment Ellis would have had to traverse. But the train would apply the emergency brakes, but not because of Ellis's warning, for next to the rails at this key moment on the other side from Ellis was the river, which, fully visible at the height of the lahar, the engine crews would have likely have seen this and slammed on the emergency brakes, but this was too late. At 10:21 PM on the 24th of December 1953, the disaster unfolded. Based upon the positions of the girders after the disaster, the bridge had been intact at this point in time, albeit damaged. As the express crossed the bridge, it happened. The bridge would then collapse under the train, causing the KA to fly through the air, striking the riverbank on the opposite side, taking with it the first 5 carriages. Due to the design of the carriages, 4 of these would be absolutely destroyed, with only the underframes remaining. The water at this point of the disaster was found to have been 6 meters high at its peak, which by my calculations is roughly a foot underneath the rails based upon the other measurements, considering the water was about 2 meters above the nearby road bridge. Seemingly due to how the train may have slowed in the final moments, the 6th carriage, Car Z, the first of the first-class carriages, had half of its leading bogie rested above nothing, with the momentum causing the carriage to teeter at 45 degrees. Cyril Ellis would be the first outside help, reportedly telling William Inglis half your train is in the river. Both men then raced to the dangling 6th carriage, urging passengers to then leave via the rear of the train, the waters of the river still swirling below. This warning would come too late as the coupling snapped and the carriage was plunged into the river, with Ellis and Inglis being pulled down with. Thankfully they were not killed in this ordeal, and with the help of Ellis's flashlight that he had tried in vain to warn the train with earlier, the passengers in the carriage were able to safely evacuate as the lahar subsided. With the help of John Holman, every person except one would be evacuated from this carriage. The final person from this carriage would tragically drown in her seat, Larissa Love, fiancée to injured cricketer Bob Blair. It is unknown exactly how she drowned. It is presumed that falling luggage had trapped her in her seat. Arthur Bell had been driving south and had seen the disaster unfold, promptly wading in to help Inglis and Ellis, while his wife drove back to the nearest town to raise the alarm of what had happened. Constable Schmidt would be the first to arrive on the scene, helping Holman and an unidentified man remove Larissa Love's body from the carriage, noting that the water had been up to his thighs when he had entered the carriage, but then the water was at his ankles when he left the carriage. The military camp at Waihuru would get this alarm and promptly sprung into action to help the survivors, although it was found that most early rescuers came from the train with men in the first-class carriages dressed in their finest, wading in the now oil-coated river to save lives. Very honourable indeed. As Christmas Day 1953 dawned, the full scale of disaster became known to everyone involved. Through the night they had toiled, working to the point and beyond fatigue to rescue as many survivors from the wrecked carriages in the river. Although it should be noted that there was eventually a point when there was no longer finding survivors and began finding victims. One such rescuer would find an unidentified woman believed dead on the riverbank, only for her to wake up as he tried to lift her. Prime Minister Sidney Holland was promptly on the scene, with H.C. Lusty, the general manager of NZR, in attendance as well. What lay before them was a grim picture. NZ Mechanical Engineering Chief W.R. Butcher had been brought in to determine what damage had been sustained and the causes of such damages. To how the express fell, he stated it looked as though the bridge had sagged while the train was crossing, with the locomotive striking a pier and then careening to its left. The locomotives and carriages were cut up and scrapped on site. I'd like to divulge here for a brief bit to discuss the findings by Mr. Butcher that I think are relevant to Ellis's discussion. A fortnight prior, he had arranged for a test where he would walk in the beam of a locomotive away from it and for the driver to whistle when he disappeared. At the distance, it was found to be 200 meters, but considering that the headlight and the condition of the locomotive wasn't the greatest, Butcher then stated that the greatest effectiveness for a standard locomotive headlight would be 275 meters. The stopping distance for a train of this size from 40 miles per hour to 0 is roughly 230 meters. HZ Purchase, an assistant engineer to Butcher, would then calculate that the final speed would have had to have been 38 miles per hour. Based upon some damage typical in emergency brake applications, Purchase then theorized that the brakes had indeed been applied just anywhere between the point of the bridge and 225 meters back, when in reality it was likely just about maybe 50 meters based upon the speed. These facts somewhat disprove Ellis's testimony and cast some doubt upon whether the engine crew saw his warning, as it is entirely possible that the engine driver Parker had seen the lahar beside him and then applied brakes, just not in time unfortunately. It is certainly possible that the train could have made it across if not for the section of the bridge that would ultimately give way. This part of the video is speculation based upon a wide array of sources, and there is reason for this. This bridge has had several floods in the years prior, notably in 1925 and 1944, where the exposed foundations of the piers were just filled in with rock. In 1946, concrete blocks were placed around Pier 4, but it is noted that by 1948, these blocks had not submerged as was intended, causing no buildup of sand or rock around this vital pier, leaving it completely exposed and vulnerable. It should be noted that engine crews had reported a slight kink in the rails as they had crossed the bridge prior to this disaster. This is where my speculation comes in, and it involves how there is the potential for the bridge to have been damaged, but not fully repaired after the 1944 flood, which could give reason to the bridge sagging during the height of the 1953 flood. A main reason behind my theory is that a direct similar flood happened in 1923, yet the bridge held intact with very minor repair work required, but it might not have been enough repair work. This also is supported by Ellis's testimony of looking back at the bridge as the express passed, and definitely seeing rails and not a gap in the bridge, although this does factor in whether there was a pier to support the train or not. Most likely not, but for all we know it could have been slightly off to the side. Now I think there is a question on some of your minds: how did this flood occur? This is the part of the story that I turn back to Mount Ruapehu. The crater lake that I mentioned before is near the peak of the mountain, being an average of 24 degrees centigrade at this time of year, relatively warm for water at this height. As the water melted the ice around it, the lake grew ever so slightly larger, therefore increasing the melt. As James Healy, superintending geologist of the Government Geological Survey, would state, he believed that the barrier at the edge of the lake had finally given way from the ice melt, causing the lake to drop 7.5 meters during its evacuation, believing this to have happened at roughly 8 p.m. As the water rushed down the mountain, it got stronger, with boulders being picked up, causing the lahar. From the evidence, Healy surmised that the lahar had reached the Tangiwai Bridge between 10:10 and 10:15, just before the express had arrived. Healy then calculated that the crater lake had lost nearly 70 million cubic feet of water, with 12 million cubic feet being the headwater of this flood. The bridge had no hope after being struck by a boulder, but if the proper repair work had been completed, it is entirely possible that the train could have made it on the other side, albeit the rear carriage is potentially derailing, causing a lesser death toll. But since the Queen was in New Zealand at the time, she would give her Christmas Day address from Government House, Auckland, adding a remembrance to the disaster that unfolded the night prior. This was how most New Zealanders found out about the disaster in the first place. There was a memorial service held in Auckland where both Queen Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh were in attendance. Back at the wreck site at this time, work was progressing on the cleanup as well as the installation of a temporary bridge, as this was a vital link between north and south. For 12-hour shifts, over 150 men toiled to build a new bridge from wood and steel, which was then designed to hold even the heaviest locomotive while a permanent bridge was installed. This temporary trestle was opened on New Year's Eve. Identification of victims was undertaken over the next weeks and months, with tragically 20 bodies would not be recovered, believed to have been swept down the entirety of the Whangaehu River and washed out to sea. The final toll of the dead would come to 151, against a total of 134 people who survived. According to sources, the total number of people that had went into the river that night was 179 passengers, which only 28 survived, which is a very high rate for second-class passengers aboard the train that night. A mass grave burial for 21 unidentified victims would happen on December 31st, 1953, with the Duke of Edinburgh in attendance. Over the years, the grave has been exhumed, and a body has been identified, then later reburied. So the current total, I believe, I'm not 100% certain on this, the current total of unidentified people in this current grave now stands at 11. The Queen would honour the 4 heroes of our story, with William Inglis and Arthur Bell receiving the British Empire Medal, with Cyril Ellis and John Holman receiving the George Medal. Only 4 George Medals had been awarded to New Zealanders prior to this point, so this was a major deal. From the Board of Inquiry investigation, many recommendations were followed. These included additional emergency equipment in the guards van, a new bridge design, potentially moving the station of Tangiwai closer to the bridge for direct monitoring, and early warning systems upriver. These were all implemented, and with the warning system stopping trains on March 18, 2007, this system was proved effective, as this warning was caused by a similar magnitude lahar, which the bridge was able to withstand. Interestingly, from the Board of Inquiry investigation, no blame was attributed, solely for the fact that one cannot charge a mountain with a crime. On December 24, 1954, a wreath was dropped from the Express, a tradition that is always undertaken every year to remember those who passed. However, there needed to be a central place for mourning, so in 1989, the lone cross that stood next to the bridge was replaced with the Tangiwai Memorial Obelisk. Gaining heritage status in 1994, you can still visit there today. Just off the highway with the view of the mountain in the distance, memorial services are held at the site every year, with excursion trains making the pilgrimage most years to take the honours of laying the wreath from this bridge. Having stood at the site, one can hardly tell that this disaster had ever unfolded, but that's what makes it more tragic. With very little physical remains, the physical memories of the survivors are all that remain of that tragic night, and with every year, that toll slightly decreases. Even the station is non-existent today, as with most other stations in NZ, was closed and torn down, the date of this unknown. In 2002, The Truth About Tangiwai would air on NZ television, which was one of the major sources I used for this video, as well as the 1986 Tragedy on the Tracks book, which was my main information draw. Both of these were incredibly informative. But I'm certain more of you know about this disaster from the Tangiwai movie made in 2011, which I have some words to say about on historical accuracy, which will be its own separate video. In 2024, as NZ played in South Africa in a test cricket series, the trophy was renamed as the Tangiwai Shield for this specific test series. The reason for this is direct remembrance to Bob Blair, whose fiancée in The Rest of Love had died on that train, in which that Bob Blair, back in 1953, had indeed been playing in South Africa at the time. This trophy is now played for in the NZ South Africa series that happens roughly every year to 2 years after the publication of this video. The night of December 24th, 1953 was a tragedy, and even with conflicting testimonies, there is no denying how this disaster should always be remembered, to remember the survivors and the victims of the Tangiwai Disaster of 1953.